Welcome to the Interdisciplinary Collaborative Workshops Public Scholarship and Teaching Fall Series. My name is Melinda Lindquist, and I'm an Associate Professor of History at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities. I'm one of the ICW co-organizers, along with Ron Amanzadi and Haider Tun, and I'm excited to welcome you to our third fall workshop, Voter Suppression, Voting Rights, and the Struggle for Democracy. Before I introduce today's event and our moderator, I want to invite you to join us every other Friday at this time for a wide-ranging series of workshops. Our next event on Friday, October 16th, will take up the issue of environmental justice, pandemics, and health inequities. Please find our complete fall lineup on our Google site. All of our workshops are recorded and available for future viewing on our YouTube channel. Over the past several years, faculty members and students across our 4 institutions, the University of Minnesota, Howard University, Morehouse College, and Spelman College, have been working together to create spaces for our scholars, students, and communities to be in conversation and work in solidarity. These workshops are an important space where we convene, speak across experiences and expertise, cross-disciplinary, institutional, and regional boundaries, and learn together and with our audience. Today's workshop, Voter Suppression, Voting Rights, and the Struggle for Democracy, invites you into this conversation with faculty, students, and activists at a critical moment in our nation's history, at a moment where the pandemic has breached the White House, and where we as a nation are having fairly unprecedented conversations about what a peaceful transition of power means and requires of us as a nation. While the 2008 election ushered in the first Black president elected by the nation's most diverse electorate, the last 12 years have witnessed a series of assaults on voting rights. These range from the removal of pre-clearance requirements in the Voting Rights Act, and the proliferation of voter ID laws. And they range from these to the strategic closure of polling sites, to the regular failure of voting equipment in low-income and minority districts, and lines that require some voters to lose an entire day of work in order to exercise their right to vote. The right to vote has grown even more perilous in the wake of the pandemic, and efforts to undermine mail-in voting and delegitimize electoral processes and systems. This workshop brings together scholars, students, and activists to explore these critical issues at both the local and national level. So welcome. We look forward to spending the next 90 minutes with you. On Zoom, the chat is open. We invite you to use that space to share your thoughts and suggestions. The Q&A is also open. We've reserved the last 30 minutes for questions from the audience, but you're welcome to share those questions through the Q&A box as they arise. You can also open up the live transcript if captioning will make this program more accessible and enjoyable. As always, we hope that the bridges that we're building between scholars, students, and activists will strengthen the work that is happening across our cities and throughout the nation around racial justice. It's now my honor to introduce the moderator of today's conversation, Professor Michael Minta, who will then introduce our panelists. Professor Michael Minta is a colleague of mine at the University of Minnesota, where he is an associate professor of political science and one of the country's leading experts in the study of the political representation of African American and Latino interests in the US Congress. His book, Oversight, Representing Black and Latino Interests in Congress, is a valuable guide that scholars, political leaders, and the legal community consult when assessing whether diversity in legislatures improves responsiveness to minority interests. Welcome, Professor Minta. Thank you for your work with ICW. Thank you for moderating today's conversation. And I am now going to turn that conversation over to you and to our invited guests.
Thank you, Professor Lindquist. It's an honor to be here and to really lead a discussion or have a very good discussion on a very timely subject, considering the 2020 election is just right around the corner. And so it's going to be, I think we're going to have a really good discussion. So let's get started. So I want to introduce our distinguished panel. So let's just start. So we have Mr. Ty Hobson Powell. Mr. Hobson Powell is the co-founder and director of policy for At Concerned Citizens DC, civic engagement coordinator at University of DC. He's also a lead organizer with the At 51 for 51 DC statehood campaign. He's also worked on Hillary for America at the 2016 presidential election as a field organizer in Erie, Pennsylvania. And he's one of the youngest students to matriculate to Howard. He earned his master's degree at 17 from Liberty University. Wow. Welcome, Ty. And we have Sean Lim. Mr. Lim is currently serving as the lead campus organizer at the University of Minnesota and for the nonprofit Minnesota Youth Collective. In his role, he provides young voters on and off campus with the tools and information they need to successfully participate in our elections. The MNYC empowers and builds the political power of young people through issue campaigns, get out the vote initiatives, fellowships, and more. Welcome, Sean. Then we have Sierra Terry. Ms. Terry has a passion for education, justice, and public policy. She worked alongside a national presidential campaign, Bernie Sanders 2020, on Stacey Abrams' 2018 gubernatorial campaign, and a nonpartisan judicial campaign, Shamela Williams, Superior Court judge in 2020. So welcome, Sierra. And then we have joining us Professor Robert Brown from Spelman University. Dr. Brown is a co-editor of After Obama, African American Politics in a Post-Obama Era. His areas of expertise are data analysis and research methods, American politics, African American politics, and urban politics. He is currently working on a book manuscript tentatively entitled Black Cities, American Dilemmas, Race and Representation, Urban America. Welcome, Dr. Brown. So that's our panel. So I wanted to get started. This question, I'll direct it to Dr. Brown, but I'd love to hear the other panelists to chime in. So the first one's dealing with voter suppression. So recently, the U.S. House passed the Voting Rights Advancement Act, and they have another bill named in former Congressman John Lewis's name that's been stalled in the United States Senate. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell told the Wall Street Journal, "There's very little tangible evidence of this whole voter suppression nonsense that Democrats are promoting," unquote. He says, "My prediction is that African Americans will turn out in a large percentage as whites, if not more so, all across the country." Is there and there might be some evidence to support the majority leader's position. He says Black and Latino voter turnout rates are high and usually approaching parity with whites. Turnout rates among Blacks have been high. The turnout in the presidential election in 2016 dipped for everybody. And then some of the studies have been somewhat mixed on strict voter IDs and turnout. So how are we to make sense of what the the Senate Majority Leader is saying, and also Democrats in the push for stronger voting rights? So we'll start with Dr. Brown.
Okay. First, I would start off from the state that I live in. Although we'll probably have higher voting rates for the presidential election, there were still several 100,000 voters purged here in voter off of the voting rolls. And that's a fact, and that's known. Like, say, for instance, Stacey Abrams lost the governor's race just by 50,000 votes, but well over that number were purged from the rolls for dubious circumstances or allegations, I guess. So it is a fact that people are being purged across the nation. That's how it started out.
Okay, so you're not convinced by the Senator McConnell's.
No, I'm not.
Sierra, what do you think about that?
First and foremost, thank you for guys inviting me for the panel. I'd like to introduce myself again. So my name is Sierra Terry. I'm a junior political science major with a minor in educational studies. And following Professor Brown, I was a canvasser / field organizer for the Stacey Abrams Gubernatorial campaign. And I like to, back up Professor Brown and saying there was hundreds of thousands of people purged from the system who voted through the NAACP and also who pre-registered for that election. And also it was a historical voter turnout and also a historical registered voter turnout for people who are voting for the first time for their governor's race. So when you have people who are being purged from the system and also peace persons who do not actually have a valid address, it's a lot of things that goes into an account when it comes to voter suppression. So that is something where I have witnessed and I've seen to back up Professor Brown's claim. But another barrier and device that is used by the state to support voter suppression and voter disenfranchisement is not only voter ID, but also to the purging of person voters, but also to, if you did not vote in the previous presidential election or local election, like you can also be purged. So if you just missed an election that was local, you can be purged from the system as well, which is actually very detriment as well.
Okay. Ty, you want to weigh in on this?
Yeah, so Melinda started off this conversation by talking about how in 2013, the Supreme Court, with the 5-member majority, gutted a lot of what the Voting Rights Act was. And with that ruling, states with the history of racial discrimination no longer have to clear the changes to their voting laws with the federal government. As a result, we have states like Georgia and Texas that now have complete autonomy to implement new restrictions to voting, stricter voter ID laws, adding barriers to voter registration like the exact name matching that was mentioned, but also closing polling locations and precincts that have traditionally served minority populations. States like Ohio have been granted the autonomy to purge inactive voters from the rolls. And so as we look at this conversation, I think that there is room for both realities to be true. There are minorities voting in record numbers, but there is also a record level of suppression to counter that effort, where people are being left out of democracy with a very clear intention. And the clearest case in our time, as everybody has remarked, is the election, the gubernatorial race in Georgia, where, for any number of reasons, it was wrong, whether it was the voter rolls or the fact that Kemp, as Secretary of State, was running an election. He was also running in, which was in and of itself somewhat of a form of suppression because he was working on the opposite side of a candidate in that race. And so I think, it's not enough for us to say that there isn't a problem with voter suppression, because there very clearly is. As Professor Brown remarked, the facts are that there were hundreds of thousands of people that were removed from voter rolls, and that's an issue.
Okay, that's a good point. Sean, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, of course. First of all, thank you for having me on. I am a student in my undergraduate studies here at the U of M, studying political science and environmental science. And I'm also a lead campus organizer for the nonprofit Minnesota Youth Collective. But I just want to echo what Ty and Sierra have just talked about. And to Senate Majority Leader McConnell's point, in his own state, there has been rampant voter suppression, right? And what is interesting is that this is happening on both sides of the aisle. It's happening, it's being perpetuated by Democrats and Republicans alike. In the recent Democratic primary between Charles Booker and Amy McGrath, there was massive shuttering of polling places across the state, but especially in the county with the highest concentration of Black voters, right? And so when you have a handful of polling places for an entire county where most Black voters reside, that's an issue. And when you have surgical precision targeting Black, Indigenous, people of color voters in terms of voter suppression, that creates an environment that is conducive for tons of corruption in the system. And so we saw on Twitter examples of people being turned away during the daytime, people banging on windows, demanding to be let into the polling place so that they could cast their vote, people who had lined up before the polls closed being turned away. And so there aren't mechanisms and infrastructure in place to prevent voter suppression. In some of these cases, a lot of the time, polling places don't have sufficient PPE. We're living in the midst of a pandemic. And I just believe that our democracy is not set up in a way that can handle what we're going through right now, a pandemic, and the vote by mail system is something that is also under attack right now.
Okay. I wanted to follow up on this question about, so the Voting Rights Act, obviously it's a federal act, but it usually focused on many of the former Confederate states, mostly Southern states. And then there's some places and counties like in New York and also Alaska, places we don't think about. And so that coverage where they had what Professor Lindquist referred to, where they had to submit any changes they made to their electoral laws, they had to submit it to the Department of Justice for review. The Supreme Court in Shelby versus Holder, basically in 2013 said, no, you don't have to do that anymore. And the Chief Justice Roberts says, we're living in a new South. Mm-hmm. But I want to, so we hear about what goes on in Texas and Georgia. But is there should we be concerned about other areas of the country in terms of voter suppression efforts or efforts to suppress votes? We could start with, let's see, Sean, we'll go back in reverse order.
Yeah, absolutely. So in every single state, without exceptions, even in territories such as Puerto Rico, there are examples of voter suppression at the local level, if not at the state level. And so there really are no exceptions. And we've seen how in 2012 here in the state of Minnesota, the voter ID ballot initiative was overturned by voters. Had that gone into effect, our historic voter turnout, being #1 in the nation, would have dramatically decreased because not everyone has a valid up-to-date ID. And that effectively strips away your right to vote. And we're seeing examples in Florida how felons for the longest time could not vote until that was restored, right? We're seeing in North Dakota the systemic targeting of indigenous communities, the need to have a valid state address when that is not the case for a lot of these Native communities. So I would say that in every single state, in the legislature and in the courts, there are cases, there are lawsuits trying to prevent people of color, Black people, Indigenous people, working class, poor people from casting their vote and having their voice heard.
Okay. Ty, you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so it's actually sort of timely because RBG had remarked in her dissent that throwing out plea clearance when it has worked, is continuing to work, is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you're not getting wet. It's the idea that even though in every locale it may not be as traditionally apparent as it has been in the former slave states, as Sean remarked, there is voter suppression that takes place in all 50 states and in all of our territories. And so it's important to have that protection in place as a safeguard, where even if it is, less of an issue in some places than others, that all voter populations are protected, that nobody is disenfranchised from being able to participate in electoral politics.
Okay. Sierra?
Can I remark?
Rob, either one of you guys chime in, either one.
Okay. I mean, voter suppression, I think, has existed, but it's somewhat of a red herring. In that this is the 21st century, and the U.S. certainly likes to think of itself as among the world's greatest democracies. It would seem that we would institute or consider measures that broaden the nature of that democracy, right? And protect just voters' rights in general. Like, why in this day and age, and I know it's in the Constitution that it's Tuesday, but why shouldn't it be a national holiday so that many workers could get the day off to vote, rather than having to take a day off from their work? Not everybody has work whereby they have the latitude to be able to vote, during a working day.
Yeah. So as a particular reform, yeah,
As a reform.
You think it would actually stimulate? Would more people actually turn out to vote?
I think it would. I can't tell you how much it would, but I think it would. I think we should think of all those measures that would increase the American turnout. I think that's important in this century, certainly. I think. But yeah. I know that, those kind of measures are often politically, challenged.
Yeah, and that's kind of like the standard belief that on each side, right? So if you have election holiday, like Tuesday should be a holiday, or if you have even some of these measures like same-day registration, election day registration, early voting, that all these things are going to have some type of partisan, it's going to benefit one group or the other, right?
So that's why they challenge, right? Yeah,
but the research is still somewhat unclear on whether those actually benefit partisans in the way that they think, right? So, so in terms of early voting, there's studies that say that most Democrats believe early voting, for some of the same reasons you're saying, Dr. Brown, that you can get more people, they can vote they can vote at their convenience. They don't have to worry about taking off their job. It's just a longer window. But there are studies that show that early voting could actually benefit Republicans.
Which I can understand.
Yeah, which is interesting. Election day voting, like same day registration, that seems to benefit Democrats along with early voting. So it's unclear if you put in certain reforms, who it actually benefits, right? Because I'm saying these studies, but it's still mixed.
Are we even at 50% turnout for the nation? I don't think we are, right?
In terms of eligible,
we certainly don't approach like Australia, for instance.
Yeah, I mean, we're up there in terms of presidential. In the presidential years, not the midterm years, it dips a lot. And then when you start breaking it about racial and ethnic group, and then you start doing it by age, obviously it goes down a lot. So this is a question I wanted to ask, because most of the research we have in terms of voter turnout, we see that younger people, 18, 19, that their turnout rate is usually lower than, say, old folks like me and Dr. Brown.
Definitely.
What explains that? I mean, do you guys think is that changing? Is there something about the newer generation where we might expect to see in this particular election those voter turnout rates going up? Maybe based on some of the works that you're doing in your organization. I'm just going to throw it out. Any of you guys can just chime in.
I think it starts with the deep distrust of systems of politics here in this America. In the 2016 election, 63.9 million people roughly voted for Hillary Clinton, 60 for Donald Trump. Over 100 million eligible voters didn't vote. And a lot of that voter apathy, I think, could be attributable to people not believing that their vote matters. And when you have almost 4 million more Americans decide they want a president only to have somebody else become president, it begs a bunch of questions when we talk about the Electoral College and really how much does our vote matter. That coupled with intentional efforts to keep people away from voting, to discourage the vote, is, I think, a lot of the reason why those statistics look the way that they do. I think right now in this moment, there are a lot of people who have not really bought in to electoral politics as the vehicle for change, but they should. And that's something that I've been pushing a lot during a lot of the protests and things that we've conducted here in DC with concerned citizens, is that, you know, there is a spirit of movement politics, and the spirit of movement politics says, I don't want to wait until the transition of power for my change, for my revolution. There are elected officials that are in right now that are accountable to my frustrations, that should do something about my frustrations right now. But we also have to bear in mind that in the event that the needle is not moving as fast as we want in our direction, it's up to us to vote people in or vote people out. And I think that, you know, when we look at Ed Markey, when we look at AOC, this sort of revolutionary introduction of young people really making their voices heard in electoral politics realm, I think that, to your point, there are more people now that are being encouraged with the power of their vote, more young people that are being encouraged with the power of their vote, because they see in real time that movement politics, I mean, the Cori Bushes, right, to start off protesting and then to transition her into a place of power where she now has a seat at the table to make decisions. I think younger people are starting to make that correlation between transitioning movement politics into the electoral politics realm. The idea that it's not enough to wax poetic on Twitter about the things you want changed. It's not enough to be frustrated in the streets. You have to weaponize that frustration and that passion through the ballot. And I think we're starting to see an increase in that. And it's my hope that as we are hopping into what promises to be one of the most contested elections of our time, but definitely one of the most important when you look at what's at stake with the Supreme Court and all of these various social issues that people see, that young people see, that now is a moment to stand up and to make our voices heard.
Yes, and also just following Hobson's Powell's great sentiments. I just feel as though for young people, you know, following the 2016 election, I was 16 at the time. So you're getting a brand new generation. I'm 19, so you're getting a brand new generation of voters. And I feel as though the younger generation, the Generation Z class, I feel as though we're able to actually mobilize together to go to the ballot. Like Hobson said, Ty said that we are able to go past the ranting on Twitter and actually use our frustrations into the ballot. Generation Z and millennials are becoming more educated to also understand electoral politics and also how it kind of frames a sort of illusion of choice. Because I feel when you try to explain to a 16-year-old or explain to an 18-year-old or anyone of that age, that 2016 election that, oh, I did vote and we did win the popular vote, but it was overturned by Electoral College, that's hard to understand, hard to grasp. So I'm not saying that Generation Z and younger millennials have possessed a pessimistic spirit, but I feel like they're starting to understand that some of our electoral politics is not really beneficial or comes into the whole framework of majority to majority. So another thing as well is that right now we are not in a form of a democracy or a complete autocracy, but a possible regime that's electoral authoritarianism. So where they have complete autonomy camouflaged as an illusion of choice. So when you think about that and you think about how young people are starting to believe that, yes, you might have lower voter turnout because they said I did go out to the polls, but my vote and my voice was not casted or was elected. And then secondly, when it comes to Ty's point, is that yes, we could put power into our voting, but we have to have power in our streets as well and power and mobility. So that really, really shapes the framework and understanding how electoral politics goes to go. We love Cori Bush and we love how she transcended from protesting into power seat, but is she able to articulate the needs that she was protesting in that seat? So that is something where we're still battling as a young people when it comes to going to the polls.
I'll say in organizing on a college campus with around 40,000 people, and in the conversations that I'm having with young people aged 18 to 36, yes, we are the fastest growing voter bloc. And yet historically we have turnout to the polls in the lowest numbers, right? And so for this reason, I believe that incumbent politicians, the status quo, and elected officials have not taken young people seriously enough. We are pandered to every election and then we're left behind in the dust, right? And so our voter bloc has the potential to become the most influential voter bloc, but we need to understand that we need to meet young people where they are. We need to understand that voting is not, it cannot be the end all be all to our political participation as conscientious citizens, right? Voting is the bare minimum. Voting, along with electoralism as we know it, is just one small tool in our toolbox. We can protest, we can lobby, perform direct mutual aid and community aid, organize, and more. But I just want people to know that we can't vote shame people if they choose not to vote, because a lot of people will vote and a lot of people won't, and that's their business at the end of the day. We can give them the tools that they need to successfully cast their ballot, but historically, a lot of marginalized communities have felt left behind by both parties, and they have not had their like needs met by elected officials. And so while we're doing everything that we possibly can to ensure that people have the tools that they need to turn out, we must also build community power. And I agree with Sierra on this, outside of the system and outside of the status quo.
Also too, just to bounce off of what Sean was saying, what you just said, we have to meet voters where they're at. And that really is just making sure people are voting not on a presidential or gubernatorial level, but local as well. There cannot be a more emphasis of making sure that your neighborhood and your community is also the one you want to be in and live in for the future generations. We cannot simply expect a president to reach all the needs of all, because all of the commonwealth of everyone. So when you're able to vote into the mayor and have more power. So just speaking from experience, you know, I was a congressional intern, and we will always have calls saying, hey, I'm just like, you know, my neighborhood, there's something going on. I'm like, okay, contact your mayor, contact your sheriff, contact your person. So people understand that electoral politics is not just on a grand scale, but also locally, and emphasize those tools to really mobilize people to go for locally. Then we will see some more, you know, change as well, because you're meeting people where they are and where they live, different from social media aspects as well.
Absolutely.
And just really quickly, and then I'll pass it to Sean, because it looked like you had something to say as well. But just when we look at what this summer has done, we saw that LAPD made a divestment of resources from the police to the communities. That was scaled locally. We've watched governors in qualified immunity with the stroke of a pen. That is change scaled locally. So as we talk about a lot of these structural changes, as we're hearing the calls for justice for Breonna Taylor, understand that district attorney is elected locally. There are so many things that we can do on a local scale. Also, to echo Sean's sentiments, you know, it's not enough to try to get mad at marginalized communities who have not felt included in electoral politics, because whether it's a Democratic locale or Republican locale, there are so many different populations who have felt left out of the promise of America. And to that end, like I said, like Sean said, I think that voting is just part of the bare minimum. You know, it's the idea of the mutual aids, of the things that a lot, you're seeing pop up in a lot of different cities, right? Where we are doing the work outside of the framework of electoral politics to really deliver on the promise that America owes us. Because you can say, oh, it's the Democrats that will save Black people. Well, Trayvon Martin happened during a Black president, a Black attorney general, right? So it's like I think we're starting to see there's an education where it's like there is no longer this identity politics that's associated with it. There was oftentimes this viewpoint that like the Democrats are the rubber stamp party of the Black people, and Republicans are the rubber stamp party over there. As we're starting to see it now, what we realize is that a lot of people's analysis is that they are two different sides of the same coin. That an America that was never fundamentally designed to be inclusive of marginalized populations will not be inclusive, no matter how well it's dressed up. And so I think to that end, as we are trying to usher in our revolution of change and moving the needle on a lot of different social issues, we put some faith in voting, certainly, with the hope that there will be sensible leadership that gets in and reflects the changes that we are asking for in the streets. But we understand, to Sean's point, that is only but a piece of the gestalt, and that we have so much more to do outside the framework of electoral politics to make things happen.
Todd, do you see that at this moment? I saw that you're working on making DC the 51st state. It seems
Right.
like it's a little bit more of an opening for that now than say when I was in college.
Absolutely. It's being anchored now to the conversation
I think
around
so.
the movement for Black and brown lives, where people realize, there's a lot of people that like to hide behind the constitutional argument.
Right.
But the only reason why DC is in the state is because the constitutional provisions call for it to be the federal seat of power. But to be intellectually honest is to say that there probably would not be a locale of majority white people that surround a democracy that they can involve for as long as this has been going on. If DC were to become the 51st state, we would be the only majority Black state, the only majority minority plurality in all of the 50 states. And it really lends itself to the idea that we're entitled to statehood in this moment. And this was a conversation that was going on before RBG's passing, but now it's sort of been amplified in the time since, where Democrats are trying to politicize it and use it as like a nuclear option. Like, okay, we'll make DC a state if you guys add this seat. What I implore people to understand as a native Washingtonian is that this isn't an issue of Republicans or Democrats. This is an American issue. This is a human rights issue.
American issue. Yeah.
We pay the highest federal taxes in the country, and we can't participate. We can't have a voice on the issues that matter. It is not a victimless crime. Our inability to have a voice at the seat, at the table, results in so many different inequities. And I mean, we could talk about it from HIV needle provision, all the way to the fact that guns flow into DC from other states with less strict gun laws. And because we don't have a seat at the table, we have no voice in that conversation. So I think that, as we are moving through these next couple months, and it's weird trying to play political forecaster these days, because there's always a new thing in the headlines every other day. But as we move forward, like you said, with the advancement of HR 51 through the House, it's my hope that we are getting more lawmakers to truly understand the power that DC statehood would have in enfranchising the over 700,000 mainly Black and brown bodies here. And I was actually privileged to personally secure endorsements from Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, along with 16 other senators and candidates who are running for president. So in the event that this all goes the Biden-Harris way in November, it's my hope that they make DC statehood a top priority, not as a matter of adding votes for the Democratic Party, but as a matter of adding Americans to a political framework that they've been left out of for centuries.
Right, for centuries, right.
No, I wanted to follow up on that. Well, actually, there were quite a few points I want to follow up on, but I want just on that particular one. So statehood for DC, you think about it, you're like, well, that's going to be very difficult, right? You need constitutional. I mean, it's going to be difficult to get everybody on board. I mean, passed Congress, signed by the president, states got to ratify it. And particularly in this polarized world, right? And also there's a question that Biden kept not answering, and also Harris haven't answered it, and the reporters about, and you said RBG, Democrats have talked, this idea has been floated by the left, if I said left on the Democratic side, that maybe there should be more people put on the court packing, especially if the Republicans proceed and replace Ruth Bader Ginsburg with a conservative justice. So I'm just wondering kind of like, what do you guys think about that proposition? Because the vice president won't answer it, and I was just wondering, would that help at all in terms of kind of this organizing and movement, like getting the courts?
Well, just really quickly to go back on a thing that you just said. Currently, as HR 51 is structured, it wouldn't have to go through all of these different levels. It's just something that would just pass through the House and then the Senate with 51 votes. And so my organization, 51 for 51, is the idea of making DC the 51st state with 51 votes in the Senate. The elimination of the filibuster in order to advance social progress. Because when we talk about any of these things that we want to bring about, whether it's the Green New Deal, whether it's police reform, when we see Mitch McConnell, who's self-declared himself as a Grim Reaper, we understand that negotiation is kind of off the table, but a simple majority isn't. And so if 51 votes in the Senate is enough to nominate 2 Supreme Court justices, then it should be allowed to enfranchise the over 700,000 residents here that have been left out. Now, to your point about loading the courts, I'm not sure exactly how I feel about loading the courts yet. I think, though, that what is undeniable is that we definitely need structural reform in our court system. I think now we're starting to have more of a conversation about if the appointment should be a lifelong thing, if there should be term limits, things of that nature. Now, whether or not seats are to be added, I'll leave that up to all the constitutionalists and those who are sort of doing that work and that research to explain why it would make the most sense. But I definitely think that at the very least, we have to revisit our judicial systems in order to make sure that they are more reflective of equity and provide, I guess, more opportunities for justice to be served.
Yes, and also just bouncing up with Ty, when you come to judicial elections, a lot of people, that's one of the lowest for the turnouts, other than any political thing, because it's nonpartisan. So a lot of people are not aware of the fact that, you know, you're able to appoint your own court or your own judge, in the circuit court or other courts in your neighborhood and also community. And also too, there is 9 justices on the court serving now. Well, 8 will the passing of RBG, but Trump is also utilizing the court as well as another voting strategy as on his team. So let's say, for example, that's if he refuses to leave. So if there is an issue with the mail-in ballot, or is there an issue with or Joe Biden actually he is declared victorious, he is trying to admit a person on the court and to replace RBG in order to rule in favor for him as well. So that is something where the Supreme Court shouldn't be utilized as a political tool. So like Ty said, we should be definitely make sure that our judicial systems is also reflective of the ideation of the majority, an ideation of not being used as a political tool or leverage over another candidate when it comes to presidential elections. And also too, I'm not want to say I'm ageist in that certain ideation, but you shouldn't be able to serve a lifelong sentence in any position. Because your ideation changes and your ideology you start to possess. So, and we shouldn't have persons holding any type of leadership position over a certain age point, because you start to develop a different type of perspective. You start to also physical side frame. So that's another thing we should really have a conversation about, of making sure that whoever we elect in high elected stakes are also reflective of the current age or system, and also well-versed of the growing population and growing technologies as well.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked that question too, because we're talking about voting rights, and clearly if, let's just say, best case scenario for many Democrats is that they win the House, they hold on to the House, win the Senate, get the presidency, but yet the Supreme Court is 6-3, and let's just say they pass the Voting Rights Act named after John Lewis, and then the courts strike it down and say it's unconstitutional. So many of these efforts to get people involved in the system and bring about the change, but then yet you have the courts. And so it is interesting to see how far Democrats will be pushed on this issue. Like I said, Vice President Biden hasn't really answered it. Senator Harris hasn't really answered that question, but people on the far left. And also we realized from the debate that Joe Biden is the Democratic Party, in case you guys didn't know that.
But he's not far left though. And that is something where I don't understand the ideation of people being, you know, claiming the title of someone as a socialist Democrat or someone who's far left, when they basically, into my opinion, are just possessing a sense of common sense of equity for all people. So that was something where even the debate really showed a lot of things. And also, like Ty said, Republican or Democrat, you know, two sides of the same coin. You know, even when the question was asked, that was, you know, the most worldwide question. He asked President Trump, will you denounce, you know, white supremacy? And even Joe Biden really didn't give a great answer to that as well. So when you think of the state and you think of the institution and you think of the government, is, you know, inherently, you know, anti-Black or not for the more marginalized voices. And that's why when people see the stakes of this election, people are looking for, because for either side of the coin, we're not getting the things that we should be granted as an institution and as a constituent and as a voting party as well. So you have the DNC, the RNC, and other institutions emphasizing do our due diligence as voting, when it's really something they need to work on, making sure they're making the effectiveness of the whole commonwealth of the state. And even if you try to think about it, democracies have to balance between respecting the will of the majority and protecting the rights of individuals and minorities. That's what democracy is. So even when political rulers dismiss the commonwealth of minorities and individuals, he's also dismissing and disregarding the entire democratic system. So that is something where we really, I feel that young people and a lot of other people during the COVID crisis that we're currently in now have developed a socialist spirit where we should not receive crumbs from our political leaders, because that's what we have been receiving, crumbs. We should be getting the whole piece of bread, you know, when we see it. And that's why I feel that this election is high stake, but it's really showing the facade of the whole electoral politics overall.
And back to Professor Minta's point, while I don't necessarily know exactly how far Democrats will go, if they get their perfect world and they get the House and the Senate and the presidency, right? What we do have to understand is that they probably will have the Supreme Court as a very central focal point around their politics for the next couple of years. And I say that because when we talk about all of the most important things in this country as far as granting rights, whether it's Roe v. Wade or Brown versus the Board of Education, it was not the president of the time that decided that. It was the Supreme Court of the time. And so when we look at the future of jurisprudence, if Democrats, the left, are truly to stand up on the ideals that they espouse, it's going to require them to revisit the judiciary and to really establish some new rules to the game. Because like you said, with the 6-3 majority, it almost guarantees that any of the progress that they hope to usher in with their platform, whether it is a more centrist Democrat platform, more farther to the left with the AOCs and Rashida Tlaib's, that it will all be shot down. And so to that end, I think that they'll be doing a lot of work around the Supreme Court for the years to come to try to make sure that there is some level of balance in that way to help them usher in their change.
I think that as Americans, we very often underestimate the power that the courts have, right? The courts are essentially a third branch of government. And while we focus on the executive branch and the legislative branch, the judicial branch has this wide reach and has real world implications for all of our lives, right? And so when we talk about systemic change, it needs to be a mass movement and a mass mobilization of people from every single corner of this country in order to have a tangible impact on the livelihoods of everyday people. So it's not this top on down approach, it's a bottom on up approach. And I find the vote, like the go vote crowd, really bold, telling people who are marginalized and disenfranchised to go vote while they're not actively breaking down the barriers that exist to participation, right? So we really need to look at what we're doing in our time, in our lifetimes, to set the foundational groundwork for posterity and subsequent generations. What are we doing to pave the way for those who will come after us. We see that in this current term, the incumbent president has been appointing hundreds and hundreds of judges to courts at every level of government, the federal courts and also state circuit courts. And so that will have lasting implications for generations and generations to come after us. And so when we look at the power that the courts have in determining whether or not we have the right to marry people we love, whether or not we have autonomy over our own bodies, whether or not we have clean air and clean water to breathe, we need to focus outside of Congress and outside of the presidency. And this, again, takes applying pressure on every single elected official and also working outside of the existing system. It took us 300, 400 years to get a Rashida Tlaib, to get an Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, to get an Ilhan Omar into office, to get an Ayanna Pressley. And at the end of the day, this is 5-10 people in a body of 400 something. And so, yes, they have power and representation matters, but at the end of the day, more has to be done because we're running out of time to address the climate catastrophe. We are long overdue in terms of addressing racial injustices and violence perpetuated against Black and Indigenous people in this country. And we need to reconcile that with this current notion of voting will solve all of our tangible problems, because it won't. After the next president is inaugurated, we need to continue applying pressure. We need to continue demanding that long overdue needs are met. Otherwise, nothing will substantially change. The status quo will continue to be upheld by special interests, by politicians who put profits over people and don't care about the needs of their constituents who are quite literally suffering in a pandemic, and prior to a pandemic have been suffering economically and socially.
Absolutely. And these are all things that we had to change. You know, a lot of people like to say that all of what we're seeing now unfold is all due and attributable to Donald Trump. Racism didn't start with Donald Trump. Racism is as American as apple pie and as baseball. And so it will not end by ushering Donald Trump out of the White House. You know, the wealth gap did not start with Donald Trump. It will not end with his removal from the White House. It is about, to Sean's point, really strengthening the voices that are in this space to make decisions, really uprooting all of what this America has and hasn't been in favor of something that it should be and can be. Because like I said, it's beyond just a few actors, right? It's an entire America that, like I said, to the extent that this America was not designed to have Black and Indigenous people in mind, not designed to have the LGBTQ community in mind, not designed to have these marginalized populations in mind, it will inherently be against them in its functioning, in its day-to-day functioning. And we see that in educational disparities. We see that in healthcare administration to Black women here in this country and the mortality rates associated with that. We see that all throughout the different spheres of this America, where we have to understand that it is about revisiting the entirety of this thing. And can't say it enough, it does not live solely in electoral politics. There has to be some radical change in this space, and every 2 years, every 4 years isn't fast enough for the change that we've deserved for so many years.
And also too, just reflecting on Ty and Sean has so eloquently expounded on that of the whole choice. But when it comes to Reconstruction and it comes to the ideation of accountability, it's a whole idea of disruption. So in order for we to truly revolutionize, we have to understand our position in the state, our position in our neighborhood, and our position in the community. So in order to do that, we have to inflict ourselves and put ourselves in positions in order to disrupt. So this is going for disruption for all levels, all occupations, for all persons. As a teacher, you don't have to continue to teach the same xenophobic, whitewashing history. You can insert histories of Black, Indigenous people. You can insert the histories of LGBTQIA people. You can start teaching. If you're an English teacher, you can start inserting the understanding of pronouns of they and them. So there's things you can do as a prosecutor. You do not have to prosecute, and also make sure that people have to go serve their crimes in a jail. You can offer rehabilitation service. You can offer community service. You can emphasize different structures in our communities to uplift and also to disrupt at a different stage. Disruption is not does not really correlate to actual violence, but it's also making sure that you disrupt the actual plan of the state. When people say life, liberty, and pursuit, it's not for marginalized communities, it's not for the minorities, it's for a certain demographic, which is really what we have is ethno-nationalism for the white hegemony. So when you think about it, we have to make sure that whatever position you in, you can still retaliate and still receive your check, because we're still in a capitalistic society. We're not socialism. So you can still do what you have to do for the means of your survival, but also making sure you keep your integrity and you keep speaking out for those who can't speak for themselves.
Well, the one thing that I like about this discussion is how you guys are realizing that voting is, it's just part of the solution. It's not the full solution. And then I know Sean mentioned something earlier about not vote shaming. And, and I was just thinking about Colin Kaepernick when in 2016, when he said that he didn't vote in the election. Yeah. And he was like, well, why should I vote? Because all I'm going to do is legitimize a system that oppresses me. So, but obviously everyone's like, I can't believe you did this. What are you doing? Are you crazy? And he didn't say anything else about it. But I am curious though, like you guys are college educated and, but most people in the country are not college educated. And we know that people who are more educated are more likely to turn out to vote and participate in politics. How do you talk to people who aren't as patient as you in terms of bringing about change? Because like, look, we went out, we participated in the protests, we voted, we thought it's like people were like in the George Floyd protests, people are like, look, we need to pass police accountability laws. And here in the Twin Cities, I mean, they didn't defund the police. There were some signals, but that didn't happen. So what do you tell people? And he's like, hey, this change isn't happening the way that you thought it was going to happen.
Yeah.
What do those conversations look like?
So, sorry.
You go ahead, Sean, you good.
Okay, yeah, thank you. So as someone who primarily works with, young college-aged people, what I hear on college campuses is fundamentally different from the reality that is, the American landscape, right? So here, like us three in colleges and people on this panel, we are living in this bubble where we have this like mindset. We surround ourselves with people who are like-minded to us. And what is important to understand about like the American fabric is that there are people who we need to meet where they are, right? There are people who have yet to be awakened, who have yet to be radicalized to the notion that there are things that fundamentally cannot be reformed. There are systems that cannot be reformed. There are systems that we need to tear down. There are systems that need to be abolished. And we need to think of creative solutions that have never before been implemented. When it comes to police, abolition is something that a lot of people, especially neoliberals and liberals, are still, afraid and reprehensive towards, because we haven't had anything outside of a police state, right? Police, modern day police as we know it, were born out of slave patrols, and that oppression of people of color, especially Black people, has continued for centuries. It's become more subtle and less subtle over the years, but it still exists, and it's deeply rooted and it can't be reformed in my view. And so that is why we need to work towards community-based solutions that have never been implemented before. We need to think creatively outside of the box and fundamentally reimagine a society where we aren't, you know, bringing more oil out of the crust of the earth, where we aren't relying on a police state for, you know, security. And so we here in Minneapolis, again, the city council, I believe they all have to be replaced, because we have people who voted for Mayor Fry's budget in 2017, who were elected in 2017 as, you know, these reformists, and they have tried every single reform in the books to reform the Minneapolis Police Department. The Minneapolis Police Department is one of the most reformed, quote unquote, police departments in the entire country. And yet, what do we have, right? Nothing has substantially changed. Nothing has fundamentally changed, because it is still the same system. So we have the same people, you know, on the city council now asking for a review of police misconduct and police brutality, right? They have this one-year study that they're going to try to do. 1 year later, it's 2021, you've been re-elected, right? You're branding yourself, you're positioning yourself, posing as this abolitionist now, when you continuously support Mayor Fry, when you continuously vote for expanding the police budget. So when it comes to people running for office, and when it comes to people holding office, you need to hold their feet to the fire, and you need to vote them out of office if they're not going to listen to your demands and listen to your needs. When you have a community that is mourning and elected officials give you this flowery language, they, you know, tell you that they're no longer a reformist, they're an abolitionist. That's simply not true. You need to look at people's records. And so records speak loudly, more loudly than, you know, politicians pandering to us. And I believe that especially, you know, younger people can see through the bullshit, right? And I think Sierra has talked about this as well, is that we don't take BS, we see through it, and we're going to organize to ensure that we get people into the halls of power and to decision-making tables that actually look like us, think like us, and are working towards a more sustainable future for all Minnesotans and all Georgians and all Washingtonians.
Also, too, with Sean, just to like piggyback off of that great, great conceptual framework, I would also say that people have to understand you cannot, you know, organize, be pragmatic with the oppressor. You can't ask the oppressor, can you stop oppressing me? Can you stop the racism? Can you stop the brutalization? That does not work. So I feel as though we have to understand that you can't vote oppression out either. So it comes with community work. It comes with community building. It comes with also understand that revolution does not happen at the polls. Revolution happens on the streets. And another thing is that we really have to understand that education is the best form of liberatorial tool. So of us people in academia, Sean said it so eloquently, we're in a bubble of people who actually will put in the persona that they do read. And they also see the historical analysis, but able to compare it and see it in real life and apply those frameworks. But we also have to hold ourselves accountable and making sure we spread our wealth and our knowledge into these streets as well. When, for example, the Atlanta University Consortium, we're in the poorest district of Atlanta in the West End. We have Spelman tuition is $57,000 a year. So we're not sharing our knowledge into those communities to help rebuild, help revitalize them and give them the necessary tools. We're also complicit in the state as well, because we're using our education as a form of selfishness, but using it to advance our own self and our vested interests and not the community as well. So when you see that, is that we have to use our knowledge and share it to others, and also making sure that we are not complicit in the state. And when we do vote, we have to stop voting strictly on identity. There is a Black queer mayor in Chicago, but is she for the Black queer folks in Chicago? She's not. So there is a Black woman, a mayor in DC. Is she for the Black youth? She is not. We have Black people, Black and brown people in certain positions of power, but they're not able to wield power due to they're actually in an internal conflict of actually, should I speak on my vested interest or should I speak on the vested interest of the Black community? Am I Indigenous or should I speak on the Indigenous populations of their community? Should I vote on this bill or I can get the certain attentions of the DNC, or should I get the attention in the RNC? So that is where we have to stop that in a certain mindset. Because if you're Black, queer, disabled, does not merely mean you're for the Black, queer, and disabled as well. And another thing, just to close off, but when we think about that, they also face an eternal conflict. All these governmental positions are not inherently to make change, to make revolution. So if I'm a congresswoman or congressman, I can only speak on things to create legislation or policies in a political standpoint, not revolution. So we shouldn't look or idolize certain congresswomen, women. I love the squad, but we shouldn't idolize them. We should make sure they're ensuring our job, ensuring the voting of their constituents, and also ensuring the vote and making sure the other 400 representatives are also adapting the same type of mindset of community building and also progression as well.
Absolutely. I think that, you know, I guess the heart of the call of the question is, what do we say to those who feel like the change isn't happening fast enough? I think for us to even understand that progress in this current system is a process, is a device of the privilege, because we are educated. We have the ability to see the inadequacies of this system in a way that make it move slow. When I think about my friends who let Facebook tell them what the news is, or, you know, who just are not privy to this knowledge that we have, right? What I tend to find is that a lot of my friends from the most marginalized communities have the most radical views about how we should usher in our change. And it's because this state has been the most radical and oppressive to them. And so what I implore them to do is, there's always this thing in DC, we say be safe, but to be a Black person in this America, to be part of the LGBTQIA community in this America, it's not enough to be safe, just be smart, be calculated about the way that you're moving to usher in your revolution. I believe that to the sentiments expressed here by Sierra and by Sean, that looks to me like an investment in community building, realizing that we are each other's business, that we can't wait for oppressors to save us, that we can't wait for institutions of white supremacy to uphold and affirm our Blackness and our differences in this space, and that we owe it to each other to build as much of that out as we can on our own, within our own communities. And to Sierra's point, that looks like going back and tapping in. You know, you look at the placement of HBCUs across this nation, and most of them are placed in a lot of the lowest income locales around. But like, there is this stigma. And when I went to Howard, I saw it. They called, you know, the neighboring Washingtonians and Lee Drake Park like locals, right? And there's this divide, this gap between what is the talented 10th of Black people in college, right? And those that have been left behind for whatever reason. And if we are not doing the work of being intentional about bridging those gaps ourselves, about reaching out, about teaching, about resourcing, you know, for me, it was something as simple as, like, I used to go and grab some kids from Leroy Park and let them come in the gym and play basketball with me, just swipe them in, play basketball. It's those little interactions, those moments that go so far towards the community building that we want, towards the systems of equity and respect and compassion that we're asking for. It's not enough to ask police to show a compassion that we're not exhibiting in our own communities. It's not enough to ask lawmakers to have an empathy that we can't have for our own people. And so I think that there is room in that space where people feel like change is too little, too late, or it's not coming fast enough, for us to, yes, hold elected officials accountable, but also to recognize in real time that we can be superheroes, that we can be the ones that really change this world in real time for somebody with just a small interaction, with just a small sharing of information. And I think that if we continue to do that work, and if everybody from all these different marginalized communities that have been left out of what this America has promised to us in the Declaration of Independence that said we're all equal, if we all choose to stand together, then we'll see the tide start to change.
Right quick. I want to commend. Okay, I'll let you.
I just want to make one. I'll let you. Just want to let the viewers know that please submit your questions, and I'll start asking them to the panelists as soon as possible. Dr. Brown, go ahead. Sorry.
I just want to commend Sean, Ty, and Sarah. I'm quite heartened and impressed by your engagement with the issues. Why do you do what you do? Given this is a bleak time for your generation. Here we have a worldwide pandemic, climate change, major inequality. I mean, so many things all at once that your generation will have to confront. What gives all of you hope? And how do you try to persuade some of your peers to be as engaged as you all are?
I know that there was a question that was floating around on Twitter. It said what radicalized you or what inspired you to do this advocacy? For me, it was being decidedly Black as a dark-skinned man in an America that looks at me and views me in the ways that it does, based strictly on the way I look and the way that I present. And it's in anticipation of the fact that one day I will have Black sons and Black daughters, and that I feel like they shouldn't have to be fighting for the same thing that their grandfather was fighting for, their great-grandparents were fighting for, and that now in this moment, we've really been presented with an opportunity to interrogate our values, to see how serious we are about effectuating this change. Like you said, to even be out and to be able to protest amidst record joblessness, amidst a pandemic that is disproportionately killing Black and brown people in different communities, is another privilege. But it is a privilege that I think that we stand in because we understand that everybody can't do it. And that it is on us as those who are able to do that work, to do the much needed work of really showing people and showing them through change that this world can be different than the world that we've been in. And I think that just the demonstrated advocacy of us stepping out there as young leaders is what inspires. I've had some of my homies that were never politically informed and never cared, and to see me leading a protest of a couple hundred downtown DC or whatever, they're like, yeah, now I want to buy into this. I want to listen more. I want to go research. And so there is, that quote about as you let your shine, you unconsciously give other people permission to do the same. I think just as, Sierra is letting her light shine, as Sean is letting his light shine, as I'm letting my light shine, it's encouraging others to come out of the darkness that is ignorance, that is inaction, and to step into a world where we're forging that light actively on any given day.
And also too, Professor Brown, I felt like what really radicalized me the most was a piece of literature called Self-Taught. So Self-Taught is by Heather Andrea Williams. It's a book about, the enslavement through all to Reconstruction era of the Black Americans enslaved to now current Black Americans becoming educated. So reading that book, it was for education course. I didn't know it was going to have so much effects, but it just showed me how far we have came. And it shows that as a people, we have mobilized. We actually built tunnels where we can become educated, eavesdropping to become educated. We were doing so much, building our own things, this church involvement. And it's seeing that shows that there is a need that we could do as a whole, that we have always been the pillars of our own thing. We have always been the movement. So that right there radicalized me to think more of that, really just insinuated to me that education really is a form. I advocate so much for education equity because your classroom dictates what you want to be. When you're your first grade kindergarten teacher, she asks, what do you want to be in your life? She asks you, I'm going to be an astronaut, I'm going to be a doctor, I'm going to be a lawyer. So your teacher is a reflection of her society, and she's reflecting on her common sexical views. So if you're not being, filled educationally, then you're not able to actually see what's going on in your perception views. But I feel like I have hope in my generation because we have a sense of community with each other via social media and also in person. I went to my first protest, the March on Washington, a couple weeks ago, and have never conversed so much and had so much light spirits around me with younger generations. So that is something where I have hope. And also another thing with the younger generation that I feel is the biggest gap is that older generations like the baby boomers and such, I don't want to categorize you all, but for some, they try to put the personas that we're lazy. We want handouts. But I feel as though we're starting to understand a little bit more that we can have the things that we want. and that we still possess and hold on to our imagination at a young age. You know, I'm 19. I don't know how old Ty is or Sean is, but when it comes to, I don't know, we're able going to get into a corporate job or get into that cubicle. But when you get into that cubicle, you're, you know, starting to really invest into the whole capitalistic spirit, where you're not able to understand or reimagine a society where you're not working for your living, you're working for your passion. You're not living just to work, but you're living to live. And I feel as though that's what our young people is really talking about now, because we're starting to say, look, I'm not going to work that 9 to 5. I'm creating my own schedule. You know, I'm also going to advocate and protest, but I'm going to party on the weekends as well. So we possess a certain duality that I feel as though brings community at the same point. So that's what's kind of radicalized me when I saw that post as well on social media.
Can I,
Sierra, you all get more.
Dr. Brown, hold on a second. I got to get a question in. Sorry.
Certainly.
So anyway, let's. We have a question from an audience member, and she's asking, I think Mara, how can the electoral vote be moved to a direct universal suffrage at the constitutional level? So I guess the way that, and you, Mara, you can chime in if I'm interpreting this, you mean if you just, everyone just had the right to vote, that you just didn't really, you didn't have to go, like if you just say 18 above, you don't have to go through any registration requirements. Just basically, if you're a citizen, don't have to register, you just vote, basically. That's what I'm reading this question as. So, I mean, has proposals been put out like that, Dr. Brown, anyone else, about just forget voter registration? If you're 18, you're a citizen, just, you have the right to vote.
Yeah, well, I know that my group, Concerned Citizens DC, we put together something that we unveiled July the 4th called the Bill of Rights for a New America. It was based on the idea the Declaration of Independence dared to utter the words, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal," while 75% of the signatories owned slaves. It's an idea that if we are to truly build the America that we deserve, it is about creating more inclusive systems. And one of those things that we had in there was automatic voter registration for everybody the age of 18. The idea being that should be something that is just as commonplace as selective service, and you got to go get your ID, right? That like if we can get tapped in to the military industrial complex, we should be able to get tapped into democracy. And I think that as we widen that pool of potential voters, that we would see some more involvement in electoral politics and more inclusiveness.
Also, to the standpoint to the electoral vote being moved to direct universal suffrage, I feel as though that would really go for this disbandment of the electoral college, really doing for majority vote. So I really feel like that will be that'll be the first step where we can really get, if you're over 18, you automatically can vote, because that discourages voters from actually voting because you don't believe the majority will win.
Absolutely.
Okay, and then we have another question by Sar. And I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your name. I'm trying my best. Do you believe that a bipartisan voting system should be? I guess what I'm taking by this question is that something that's possibly neutral in terms of a sense. I mean, where it's not so. Because right now, as I understand it, most of these systems are Democrats, Republicans. They have someone at the state and local level. But I'm also interpreting this question to mean, what does it mean in terms of if we remove party labels from elections? I mean, I don't know if that.
Partisan.
Yeah. What do you think?
Educate me. So you still have to fill out for selective service once you get of age. See, I remember doing that way back when for myself, but I think still had that at the office.
But also too, I for to Sarah Blanchard's point, our country is, missuited for a two-party system. I do see that there is inequities for people who are third party or independent. You can see that in the House of Representatives. So let's have to make that happen. What I think will be the requirement of no labels, which I think, in my opinion, I honestly think we will not have a two-party system come the electoral politics in 2028. That's what I think wholeheartedly. But I do think that would be the requirement of the disbandment of the labels. But for your question, for the bipartisanship voting system, it really comes down to funding, and also comes to how many people we have in the Senate. That will require a lot of work as well when it comes to that, to making it to widen to all parties.
I think if there were no labels, like if there wasn't Democrats or Republicans, I think it would challenge voters to explore their philosophical alignment with the candidates.
Absolutely.
A lot of different people who, like I said, they're especially prominent in minority communities, where if they don't know anything about the issues, let me just pick the Democrat, because surely they're my person, right? Surely they're going to be my interests. And there's a lot that's lost in that. There's a lot of accountability that is lost in that for elected officials. I think that if, to the point of the question, there were no labels, but instead people had to run on the merits, had to run on their issues, then we would have a bit more transparency in terms of running, because you're running as a candidate based on your slate. You're not running based on party associations. I think that it's a lot of the problem that I personally have with the Democratic Party up until this point is that because they understand that they have been the rubber stamp party for minorities, they have not been as active in their agency for ushering our change in as we need to, because they understand that being slightly left to a far right party makes them our party. And that to me is ridiculous. So I think that, just the idea of the elimination of that political identity in that way, to instead realign based on principle, would challenge people to go explore the issues more, to fill out the field for where they feel like they fall in line with candidates. And I think that if everybody was just running, like I said, not as parties, but instead just as people, somebody from the Green Party might win, right? Somebody from the Libertarian Party might win, right? Because these values, it would then become a values-based election where we are not, oh, I have to pick a Democrat or a Republican, or if I don't pick one of them, then my vote is wasted. It'll just be like, I have to pick the person that makes the most sense for me and for what I care about, for my community and my community values. And, to Sierra's point, I don't know if it'll happen in 2028. I mean, I have high hopes every day that this two-party system breaks on any given day. But
the parties are evolving right now because
Exactly.
the candidates knocked off the incumbents.
Yeah.
Yes, and also too, I think 2028. I say 2028 because I think now the DNC, I think, kind of did, in my opinion, didn't do a great job for this election in terms of them. Yeah, at all. So I wanted to say that, but there's no true Republican or true Democrat. We have the moderate Democrat, we have the moderate Republican. So that, and even Trump is not an actual true Republican because he does not hold those same traditional values. So if we're not really holding up to those two belief systems, then you might as well look at the transparency of the person's issues and things. But with the whole Republican Democrat title, I feel like that really goes, it really has to be adjusted to the overall system. But I do think we can have an independent to really come in there and sweep the case. But it really comes down to the funding of the DNC and the RNC the most. And plus, too, independents are kind of ostracized on the Hill as well. Like, I remember there was a Republican who stepped down and went to an independent. He got kicked off his committees. He was not able to really vote. Yeah. So that's what I'm saying. So they really kind of discourage people to choose a title when they're really not one.
From your lips to God's ears, Sierra, I really was hoping, honestly, my hope was that the first time around we saw what the DNC did to Bernie, that he decided to go ahead and step out and run as a third party candidate, because then it would have invited the conversation of somebody who is actually viewed as legitimate in that political space to really advance, some more of that conversation. I see somebody in the chat, so they want to hear Sean. Sean, you got some words for us?
I do. So to touch on briefly the two questions that were just brought up, the first one, tied to your point, automatic voter registration is so crucial, so important to expanding the amount of people who are eligible to vote, right? In this country, in the US, we're born in a hospital and we get a social security number, we get all of this information. The national government has our information, our birth location, what district we live in, how old we are, we pay taxes, all of this information is stored by the IRS. It is exceedingly important and easy for large institutions to have automatic voter registration, an opt-out system instead of an opt-in system. If you have our information on file, all you have to do is have us update our address every time we move, right? And so there are these hoops and barriers in place to voting. Why? Because they don't want us to vote. They don't want our voices to be reflected in who represents us, right? The overwhelming amount of money in politics as well. I think Sierra and Ty, you both mentioned this, but the amount of money in politics prevents, ordinary people like you and us, working class people, from having our voices accurately represented in Congress and in the White House. And so academic institutions have all of our financial information, have our addresses. If the University of Minnesota, per se, had a opt-out voting system where it automatically registered every single student to vote at their home address or their on-campus address, and if you didn't want to vote, you can just tick a box online. It's as simple as that. Everyone is registered. But yet, organizations like the Minnesota Youth Collective have to go door to door, have to canvass people on campus because people don't know that they have to update their voter registration information when they move out of the freshman dorms, right? And so the second question, we live in this hyper-polarized, hyper-partisan, state in this country whereby people don't feel themselves reflected in the Democratic or Republican Party. People see themselves reflected in the issues, right? We had a candidate in Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent senator from Vermont, who ran on the issues. He wanted people to have affordable healthcare. He wanted clean air and clean water for posterity, and he wanted equality on social issues, economic issues, and also in the environmental front, right? And then we have a candidate, and now, Democratic nominee in Joe Biden, who ran on the sense that he is the antithesis of Trump. And so when your campaign is founded on the basis that you aren't Trump, what do you actually stand for? What are the issues that you're going to champion that will bring about tangible impacts to people's lives? When we have our neighbor to the north, Canada, has a parliamentary system. It's not a two-party system. It's not this dichotomy. We need to shift the paradigm to what can be possible if we shift to a different system of government whereby there are multiple parties, and in any given district, there's a fair chance that someone who's not part of the Conservative Party or the Liberal Party in Canada, like the NDP, can run, win a seat, and they can have a minority government where two parties team up, and then you can bounce back ideas back and forth. We saw, just 2 weeks ago, the NDP, which is, one of the more progressive parties, and the Liberals, who are center-left, partnered up in this minority government. And the NDPs have been applying pressure to make sure that the Liberals pass, income guaranteed and paid sick leave during the pandemic, making sure that people who are out of a job get $500 a week and $2,000 a month. And so we need to have candidates run on the issues. And I believe that gradually over time, again, the two-party system has existed for such a long time, it's hard to envision and have a sense of what our country looks like without it, in the absence of it, similar to police and abolition, similar to the dependency on fossil fuels. And so what we need to do is radically imagine what is possible outside of the system, the status quo that we've been force-fed and have grown up in, right? We're disillusioned, but we need to remain optimistic in understanding that what we can do in our lifetimes, every inch that we push in the right direction will eventually lead to us being a mile down the road, years and decades and centuries from now. So what are we doing to pave the way for people that come after us, and also making it easier for progress to be made down the road? Yeah.
You should run for president, Sean. You'd be a whole lot better than these other guys, man.
So I wanted to, first of all, it's been a great panel, and we have about 2 minutes left. And so I wanted to give everyone, say maybe about 45 seconds to a minute, or 45 seconds to wrap up. Where do we go next? What any type of practical solution would you suggest to the audience in terms of like voting and the elections and just getting involved in general? We'll start with Sierra.
So I just have three things. So the first thing I would just recommend overall is to create and curate your own voting plan, and also make sure that your neighbors are voting too. So that guarantees your right to vote and guarantees you're ensuring your vote. And make sure you curate, make sure you have a good solid plan, be it mail-in or also in person. Secondly, it's also to take a second to reimagine a society that's beneficial to you. So whether you write down your response, but just sit back and actually see what's beneficial. And the third thing I will also say is get community organized. So see what's going on in community, see who's also the leaders, and also see who's actually creating events for the advancement of your community, be it NAACP, be in your electorate, or be a church. But just look at those three things and see how you can be involved.
Okay, so we're out of one. You want to say one more thing? Anyone want to say one more thing? We're out of time. Wanted to add anything to what Sierra said?
Sean?
Sure, yeah. So the org I work at, Minnesota Youth Collective, we are texting 50,000 voters every single week leading up to the election. This past month, I personally have texted 50,000 voters. And what I've seen is that there is this distrust and this rampant misinformation about voting by mail. Voting by mail is by far the most safest option that we have in a pandemic. You can vote from the comfort of your couch in your home. Simply go request it, and you'll get the ballot in the mail. You fill it out, you put the ballot back in the mailbox, you're done, and you can track it online. And so there is this, distrust, and I believe partly this is being spread by the president and the Republican Party, that voting by mail is conducive to voter fraud. This is simply not true. There's no evidence to back this up. Voting by mail is safe and sound. Just make sure that you get your ballot in. We recommend by October 20th so that the USPS has time to process it. But as long as it's postmarked by November 3rd, you're good to go. If you are voting in person, please make sure to mask up, sanitize your hands, wear gloves if necessary, but make sure that, like Sierra said, do the next step. You vote, you post a graphic on Instagram maybe, and then what? What are you doing in the community beyond that Instagram graphic, beyond that tweet, beyond that go vote or vote blue no matter who, or vote for Trump, whatever you're doing? What are you doing to actually help your neighbors, right? Help the people that you don't know down the street in your city. Are you doing mutual aid work? Are you opening your purse and making sure that you are using your financial tools and your economic resources to uplift the people who are unsheltered in your community? Are you writing letters to your state representative? Are you calling your governor? Are you calling your city council member? Are you calling the park board? What are you doing beyond casting your ballot? Because casting your ballot is the bare minimum and the bar is in the ground. You need to be doing more and stepping up in your community, on your campus, in your church, in your mosque, in your classroom, in your family. There's so much more to be done, and voting is just the tip of the iceberg.
Ty?
I think that just summing up everything that's been said here, what we are fighting for is a radical revolution of love and a radical revolution of imagination. But being able to see the world not as it has been, but as it will be. And I think that to that end, we mustn't allow finite disappointments of what America has been undermine the infinite promise that exists when we choose to get together and create the change in real time. And like I said, it doesn't exist in waiting. It exists in doing everything that we can with all the moments that we're powerful to, voting, but then going as soon as we leave the ballot back to our communities and in real time translating that to change. So please, everybody, go vote. To Sean's point, don't buy into the misinformation campaigns that tell you that you shouldn't vote, that you shouldn't vote via mail. Also, to another point, don't forget that we are in the middle of a pandemic that has now claimed over 200,000 lives. And just be safe. Take care of yourself. Take your vitamins, get some rest, wear a mask. Just really do all the things. And lastly, just try to exhibit the level of compassion and empathy that you want to see in the world, because that, I think, is how it will change the world.
Thank you. Dr. Brown, got the last word?
Let's see. I think it's just important for people to educate themselves about the issues that confront our society, not only American society, but the world society, and that it's incumbent upon us not only to be American citizens, but to be global citizens. I'll just end it there, but thank you. This has been a great conversation, and I'm very fortunate to have been a part of it. And we're very fortunate to have done it.
Well, thank you for joining us. Well, I want to thank all our panelists. I think I think I learned a lot, and hopefully the audience learned a lot too. Also, just remember the election is coming up soon. Vote. That's important. But as our panelists said, it's just one of many things that you can do. So if you can get involved in organizations, if you can educate people, and if you have the time, those things are important too. And then when the election is done, the work just begins. So I encourage you to continue to be active in your organizations. Remember, it doesn't have to be a huge organization. It can be a campus organization. It can be a small organization, and have your issue and your voice heard. So thanks so much. Have a good day. Thanks, panelists.
Yeah.
Have a good weekend, everyone. Bye.
Bye.